Between November 1977 and March 1978, 11 people were eliminated across the remote ridges of Madison County, North Carolina, in what would become known as the Blue Ridge Reckoning. All adults, all connected to bootleg operations that had survived Prohibition, the Depression, and federal crackdowns. The method was varied: rifle shots from distance, accidents on mountain roads that weren't accidents, bodies found in places they shouldn't have been. The perpetrators weren't outsiders or revenue agents. They were four brothers from the Hensley family, moving through the mountains like winter fog, methodically erasing everyone who'd burned their still. The FBI would later call it one of the most calculated revenge campaigns in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't territory, wasn't competition for markets, wasn't even a dispute over money. It was a copper still that had been in the Hensley family for 43 years, burned to scrap by men they'd done business with for decades. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Marshall, North Carolina, wasn't much more than a wide spot where Highway 25 crossed the French Broad River in the autumn of 1977. Population maybe 800, spread across the tight valley and up into the surrounding mountains where Madison County gave way to steep ridges covered in oak, hickory, and pine that had seen 2 centuries of settlement and poverty. The nearest real city, Asheville, sat 23 miles south on roads that turned to mudslides when it rained and ice when winter came down from the high country. Most folks in Marshall had never been farther than Knoxville, 70 miles west across the state line. November in the mountains meant temperatures dropping to 30 degrees at night, climbing to maybe 55 by afternoon if the sun broke through. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves, damp leaves rotting on the forest floor, and that particular sharp scent of approaching winter that people who live in the mountains learn to recognize as warning. Mornings brought fog so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The sound of the place was wind moving through bare branches, distant chainsaws cutting firewood, and every so often the rumble of a pickup truck grinding up impossible grades in low gear. But 1977 was a dying year in western North Carolina. The tobacco economy that had sustained these mountains for generations was collapsing under federal regulations and changing markets. The textile mills that had provided second incomes were closing, moving production overseas where labor was cheaper and unions were non-existent. In Madison County, unemployment hit 37% that fall. For families who'd survived on combinations of farming, mill work, and seasonal labor, watching the economy disintegrate felt like the ground opening up beneath them. In places like Marshall, moonshine wasn't just an underground business, it was infrastructure. Had been since before the Civil War. Federal taxes on legal liquor made it too expensive for mountain people who earned maybe $4,000 a year if they were lucky. So they made their own, following recipes and techniques passed down through generations, using skills their ancestors had brought from Scotland and Ireland and perfected in these same hollows. The law said it was illegal. The mountains said it was survival. And in 1977, with no other options available, bootlegging was the difference between feeding your family and watching them go hungry. The Hensley brothers, Virgil, Raymond, Curtis, and Tom, were known throughout Madison County not for being the biggest operation or the most aggressive, but for being reliable. Virgil was 44 years old that November, though he looked older. He stood 6'1", lean and ropey with muscle built from decades of physical labor that never stopped. His face was weathered like old leather, deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting into sun and smoke. A scar ran along his right hand where a piece of copper had sliced him open when he was 16, learning the still from his father. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen from old breaks that had never been set by doctors because doctors cost money. When he shook your hand, You felt the strength there, the kind that came from splitting wood and hauling copper and doing everything the hard way, because there was no other way available. Every morning, Virgil woke at 4:30 in the house his grandfather had built in 1921, made coffee in a percolator on a wood stove, and sat at the kitchen table rolling cigarettes from loose tobacco while he planned his day. He didn't talk much in those early hours, just sat, smoked, drank coffee so strong it could strip paint, and thought. By 5:30 he'd be out the door, checking the still hidden 3 miles back in the woods, following trails only he and his brothers knew. He'd married Sarah Louise Patterson in 1954, right after he came back from Korea with frostbite scars on his feet and memories he never discussed. They'd had 3 children, all grown now, all moved away to places where work existed. Sarah was 62, her hands as work-worn as Virgil's, her face still beautiful despite everything the mountains had demanded from her. What Virgil valued most wasn't money. He'd never had much anyway. What he valued was reputation. In an economy built on handshakes and word of mouth, reputation was the only currency that mattered. The Hensley liquor was known for being clean. No methanol, no additives, no shortcuts that could blind you or kill you. Their weights were honest, their prices consistent, their word absolute. When they said they'd deliver on Friday, you got your delivery on Friday. When they quoted a price, that price didn't change based on desperation or leverage. For 43 years, since Virgil's father had set up the family still in 1934, the Hensleys had built something more valuable than money. They'd built trust in a place where trust was rare and betrayal was common. Raymond was 41, shorter than Virgil at 5'10", but built solid with a barrel chest and arms thick from years of manual labor. His beard had gone mostly gray, though his hair still held some of its original brown. He had a quiet, careful voice, the kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying, who listened more than he talked. He'd worked at the textile mill in Marshall until it closed in 1974, then went full-time into the family operation because there was nothing else. Curtis was 38, the talker of the family, with a quick smile and an easy way with people that made him good at managing relationships with buyers. He could remember everyone's name, knew how to read when someone was trustworthy and when they were trouble. He'd served 2 years in Vietnam, came back in 1968 with malaria and nightmares, found that working the still was one of the few things that didn't trigger the darkness. Tom was 35, the youngest, the one who'd tried hardest to build a life outside the mountains. He'd gone to community college for 2 years, worked construction in Charlotte, got married to a girl from Morganton, but the marriage fell apart in 1976, and he came home to find that the only people who understood him were his brothers, and the only work available was the work his father had taught him. The Hensley still was hidden 3 miles up Shelton Creek, in a hollow so dense with laurel and rhododendron that you couldn't see it from 20 feet away. The location had been chosen by Virgil's father in 1934 for its water source, a spring that ran clear and cold year-round, essential for good liquor. The still itself was a work of craftsmanship, built from copper that had been acquired piece by piece over decades, soldered and fitted with the kind of precision that came from generations of accumulated knowledge. It could produce 30 gallons a week when running full-time, though they usually kept it to 20 to maintain quality. The copper had developed a patina over 43 years, the kind of seasoning that couldn't be replicated, that contributed to flavor in ways no one could quite explain but everyone could taste. That still represented more than equipment. It represented family history, accumulated skill, proof of competence in a craft that demanded respect because mistakes could kill you. In the mountains, anyone could buy corn and sugar and yeast. But building a still that produced clean liquor consistently, that didn't explode or poison people, that generated income year after year, that took knowledge, patience, and ability that couldn't be bought or stolen. The Hensley still was their credential, their resume, their inheritance. It was the only thing of value they could pass to the next generation in a world where families like theirs had nothing else. The burn happened on November 3, 1977, a Thursday night when temperatures dropped to 28 degrees and frost formed on every surface by midnight. Virgil found it the next morning during his routine check. He'd walked the 3 miles from the house, following trails he could navigate blind, emerged into the clearing where the still should have been, and stopped dead. The copper was twisted and blackened, melted in places where someone had used gasoline or kerosene as accelerant. The mash barrels were overturned and smashed. The cooling coils were crushed. Even the stone furnace had been partially dismantled, rocks scattered across the clearing like graves. But nothing was missing. No copper taken for scrap, no product stolen, no supplies hauled away. Someone had burned it purely to destroy it, to send a message that was unmistakable in its meaning. Virgil stood there for 30 minutes, not moving, just looking at 43 years of family work reduced to charred metal and ash. He felt something cold settle in his chest, something that went deeper than anger. This wasn't theft. This wasn't competition. This was an insult, a statement that the Hensleys didn't deserve to make liquor, didn't deserve their reputation, didn't deserve to exist in the mountain economy. Someone had looked at everything his family had built and decided to erase it. He walked back down the mountain, found Raymond working on a truck engine in the barn behind the house, told him what happened. Raymond didn't say anything, just wiped his hands on a rag, walked to the house, found Curtis and Tom. All 4 brothers drove up the logging road as far as they could, then walked the trail to the still site. They stood there in silence, looking at the destruction, each of them calculating what it meant. The copper alone would cost $1,500 to replace, money they didn't have. The lost production would mean no income for months. But worse than the financial loss was the message. Someone had declared that the Hensley reputation was worthless, that 43 years of honest dealing meant nothing, that they could be erased without consequence. Curtis spoke first. "Who knows about this site?" "Everyone who's done business with us for 20 years, Virgil said. "Could be 30 people, could be 50. "Narrow it down," Tom said. "Who's got reason?" They spent the next hour discussing possibilities. The Presley operation over in Laurel Valley, competitors who'd always resented that Hensley liquor commanded better prices, the Morrison boys from Spring Creek, younger generation who thought the old ways were stupid and wanted to consolidate territory, Jake Ramsey from Walnut, who'd accused Virgil of undercutting him 2 years ago, accusation that was false but created bad blood. The list grew, but nothing pointed clearly to anyone. "We take it to Coleman," Raymond said, referring to Herschel Coleman, an older bootlegger who'd been in the business since the 1940s and functioned as a sort of informal mediator when disputes arose. "Let him put the word out. Find out who did this." They drove to Coleman's place that afternoon, found him working in his barn, 73 years old, but still moving like a man 20 years younger. When they explained what happened, Coleman's face went dark. He walked them back to his house, poured coffee, listened while they detailed the destruction. "How much you lose?" Coleman asked. $1,500 in copper," Virgil said. "Maybe 3,000 in lost production over the time it takes to rebuild." "And 43 years of proving we know what we're doing," Curtis added. "That still was our reputation." Coleman nodded slowly. He understood. In the bootleg economy, reputation was everything. Lose your reputation and you lost your market. Nobody bought from people they didn't trust. "I'll put the word out," Coleman said. "See what shakes loose. But you need to understand something." He looked at each brother in turn. "Whoever did this wanted to hurt you bad. They didn't steal nothing, didn't try to hide it. They wanted you to know someone burned you down and got away with it. That's not business, that's personal. So what do we do? Tom asked. You let it cool, Coleman said. Rebuild. Show you can't be put down that easy. Starting a war over this will just get people killed, and it won't bring back your still. The brothers left Coleman's place as the sun was setting. They drove home in silence, each processing what they'd been told. Let it cool, rebuild, accept that someone had destroyed everything they'd built, and walk away. That was the advice. That was the path of least resistance. That was survival. But there was another interpretation possible, one that grew louder in the silence of that truck cab as they wound through mountain roads in growing darkness. If stills could be burned without consequence, then reputation meant nothing. If 43 years of honest dealing could be erased by one night's violence, then the entire economy they'd built their lives around was a lie. And if the response to destruction was to rebuild quietly and hope it didn't happen again, then they weren't craftsmen. They were marks, waiting to be victimized again whenever someone decided their existence was inconvenient. That night, while Virgil lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to her breathing and the sound of wind in the trees outside, he made a decision that would cost 11 lives and destroy 24 families on both sides. He decided that if someone had declared the Hensley reputation worthless, then the only response that mattered was to prove the cost of that declaration was higher than anyone could afford to pay. The investigation took 3 weeks. Not official investigation. There was no law enforcement involved because you didn't invite law enforcement into bootleg disputes unless you wanted everyone arrested. This was mountain investigation, the kind that relied on relationships and observation and careful conversation. Curtis handled most of it because he was good with people, good at asking questions that didn't sound like questions. He visited buyers, mentioned the burn casually, watched reactions. Most expressed genuine sympathy. Some offered to loan money for rebuilding. A few seemed uncomfortable, changed the subject, and that discomfort was telling. By late November, a pattern emerged. The Morrison boys from Spring Creek, Darren, Mitchell, and Kyle Morrison, along with 3 cousins who worked their operation, had been talking about the Hensley burn with satisfaction barely concealed. They'd told people the Hensleys had gotten soft, that the old ways were dying, that maybe it was time for new blood to take over. Mitchell Morrison had been drinking at a bar in Hot Springs and said something about the Hensleys needing to learn that reputation didn't mean shit if you couldn't protect your equipment. Someone who heard that conversation mentioned it to Curtis, not as accusation but as gossip, and Curtis filed it away. The Morrisons were younger generation, men in their 20s and early 30s, who'd grown up watching their fathers struggle and decided the problem was cooperation. They wanted to consolidate operations, eliminate competition, run the mountain liquor trade like a business, instead of a collection of family operations that coexisted through mutual respect. They'd approached Virgil 2 years earlier about combining operations, and when Virgil declined politely, explaining that the Hensleys preferred to work alone, the Morrisons took it as an insult. In their minds, the old man's refusal to acknowledge their vision was the kind of disrespect that needed correction. The Morrisons ran their operation out of a hollow-up Spring Creek, about 8 miles from the Hensley place. 5 men total, the 3 brothers and 2 cousins, Billy and Roger Morrison. They'd built their still in 1975, used modern equipment, pressure cookers that could produce more volume faster. Their liquor was adequate but not exceptional, and they compensated for quality with lower prices and aggressive marketing. They'd been steadily taking market share from smaller operations, and the Hensley burn fit their pattern of eliminating competition. By early December, Curtis had enough information to feel 90% certain. He brought it to his brothers on December 4th, a Sunday afternoon, when they were all at Virgil's place, ostensibly for Sunday dinner, but really for the conversation they'd been building toward for a month. "It's the Morrisons," Curtis said. He laid out the evidence, the comments, the satisfaction barely concealed, the timing that matched when the Morrisons had been expanding their operation. They burned us to send a message, show everyone that the old ways don't matter, that they're the new power. "You sure?" Raymond asked. "Sure enough," Curtis said. "Maybe 90%. Tom spoke up. 90% isn't 100. If we're wrong, then the real people who burned us are still out there," Virgil interrupted. "But if Curtis is right, and I think he is, then we got a choice. We can rebuild and hope they leave us alone. Or we can make sure nobody ever thinks burning our still was free." They sat in silence. Outside, winter was settling in, temperatures dropping into the teens at night. The mountains were going dormant, everything shutting down until spring. This was the off-season when nobody ran stills, because the cold made production difficult and buyers were scarce. It was also the time when scores got settled, when the isolation of winter provided cover for things that couldn't be done in the busier seasons. Coleman said, "Let it cool," Raymond pointed out, said starting a war gets people killed. "Coleman's 73 years old," Virgil said. "He's from a time when respect meant something, when burning someone's still would get you blackballed from the whole trade. But times have changed. The Morrisons proved that. They burned us because they thought they could get away with it, because they thought reputation was just a word." "So what are you saying?" Tom asked, though he already knew. "I'm saying if stills can be burned, then the people who burn them can be erased," Virgil said quietly. "I'm saying reputation is either worth defending or it's worth nothing, and if it's worth nothing, then we're done anyway. Might as well go down fighting." Curtis looked at his oldest brother. "You're talking about killing them, all of them." "I'm talking about showing everyone in these mountains that there's a cost to destroying what we built," Virgil said. "That you can't just burn people out and expect to walk away laughing. The Morrisons wanted to show they were the new power. We show them they miscalculated." Raymond stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the mountains that had been home to 5 generations of Hensleys. "Once we cross that line, there's no coming back. We'll be murderers, not bootleggers." "We're already criminals," Virgil said. "Been criminals our whole lives. The law doesn't distinguish between making liquor and killing people. Both get you prison time. The only difference is one keeps you alive and poor. The other keeps you alive and respected." They argued for 3 hours, circling the same points: the risk, the morality, the consequences, the alternatives. Tom suggested burning the Morrisons still in retaliation, evening the score. Curtis pointed out that would just start a cycle of escalation. Raymond asked if they'd thought about their families, what would happen to Sarah and the others if this went wrong. But underneath all the arguments was a simpler calculation. The Hensley reputation had been destroyed. They could either accept that destruction and become irrelevant, or they could prove that destroying the Hensleys came with a price nobody would pay twice. By 9 that evening, they'd reached a decision not through agreement but through exhaustion. They would do what needed doing. They would eliminate the Morrison operation completely, not burn their still, not rough them up, but remove them from the mountains permanently. They would do it carefully, methodically over time, and they would make sure everyone understood why it happened so the lesson stuck. 5 targets, Curtis said, pulling out a piece of paper and writing names: Darren, Mitchell, Kyle Morrison, Billy and Roger Morrison. We take them all, no survivors to retaliate. "When?" Tom asked. "Winter," Virgil said. "Spread it out over a few months. Make it look like accidents, hunting mishaps, bad luck. By the time anyone connects it to the still burn, we'll be done." "And the copper?" Raymond asked. "We rebuilding?" "Not until this is finished," Virgil said. "We rebuild after. Show everyone we're still standing when the Morrison operation is gone." What the Hensley brothers didn't understand, sitting in that kitchen making plans that would end 11 lives, was that violence has its own logic, that once you decide certain people deserve to die, the definition of deserve expands, that the line between justice and murder isn't drawn by the perpetrator, but by the world that has to live with the consequences. They were about to discover that erasure, once started, doesn't stop at 5 names. It spreads like fire, consuming everything it touches until only ash remains. The first target was Billy Morrison, 31 years old, the cousin who worked the Morrison still but lived separately from the main family compound. Billy had a small house off Spring Creek Road, lived alone, spent most evenings drinking beer and watching television in isolation because his wife had left him 2 years earlier and he'd never quite recovered. He was the softest target, the easiest to reach, the one whose death could most plausibly be explained as accident. December 14th, 1977, a Wednesday night when temperatures dropped to 15 degrees. Billy Morrison's truck was found at the bottom of a 40-foot embankment off a switchback on Spring Creek Road, where the road curved sharply and the shoulder dropped away into nothing. The truck had apparently gone over during the night, rolled 3 times, crushed the cab. Billy died on impact, according to the medical examiner, who did a cursory autopsy and ruled it accidental death caused by driving too fast on icy roads while intoxicated. Blood alcohol content was 0.17, well above legal limits. Nobody questioned it because Billy had a history of drunk driving, 3 DUIs on his record, and the accident matched a pattern everyone expected. What nobody knew was that Virgil and Raymond had followed Billy's truck that night, waited until he reached the switchback, then used Raymond's truck to force Billy's vehicle off the road at the precise point where the shoulder disappeared. They'd scouted the location 3 times, knew exactly where the weak point was, timed it perfectly. After Billy's truck went over, they'd climbed down, found Billy dead or dying, and left him there. They'd poured half a bottle of whiskey in the cab to ensure the blood test showed intoxication. Then they'd driven home, arrived by midnight, and told no one. The Morrison family grieved, held a funeral, buried Billy in the Spring Creek Cemetery without suspecting anything. It was winter, roads were dangerous, Billy drank too much. The explanation satisfied everyone. The second target was Roger Morrison, 28 years old, the other cousin who worked construction in Asheville during the summer and helped with the still during off-season. Roger was careful, didn't drink much, drove safely, but he hunted, and hunting season provided opportunities that didn't exist other times. January 7th, 1978, a Saturday morning when deer season was in full swing and the mountains were full of men with rifles. Roger went hunting alone, told his girlfriend he'd be back by noon, hiked up into the high country above Spring Creek. He was found 2 days later by a search party, dead from a gunshot wound to the chest that had severed his pulmonary artery. His rifle was found 15 feet away, and the initial assumption was that he'd stumbled, fallen, and somehow shot himself. The trajectory was wrong for that explanation, but hunting accidents were common enough that nobody investigated deeply. The sheriff ruled it accidental death, and Roger was buried next to his cousin Billy. What nobody knew was that Curtis had been following Roger that morning, tracking him through the woods with skills learned in Vietnam. Curtis had waited until Roger was alone in a clearing, used his own rifle to shoot Roger from 200 yards, then positioned Roger's rifle near the body to suggest an accident. He'd worn gloves, left no brass casings, took a route out of the area that left no trail. By the time Roger's girlfriend reported him missing that evening, Curtis was home, his rifle cleaned and stored, his alibi prepared. 2 Morrison cousins dead in 6 weeks. The family was grieving but not yet suspicious. Accidents happened in the mountains, especially in winter. Billy's drunk driving and Roger's hunting mishap were tragic but explicable. Nobody connected them to the still burn in November because there was no obvious connection. But the Hensley brothers knew they were running out of time. 2 accidental deaths in the same family would be accepted. 3 would raise questions. 4 would trigger investigation. They needed to accelerate the timeline, finish the job before pattern recognition emerged. The problem was the remaining 3 Morrisons, Darren, Mitchell, and Kyle, lived together on the family property, a compound up Spring Creek that was essentially fortified. They'd built 3 small houses on 50 acres close enough that they could watch each other's backs. After Roger's death, they'd become more cautious, traveling in pairs, avoiding isolated locations. Taking them one at a time would be difficult. Virgil decided they needed to shift tactics. Instead of making deaths look accidental, they needed to create a situation where all 3 brothers were vulnerable simultaneously. That meant finding a location where the Morrisons gathered regularly, a place where 3 deaths could be explained as something other than execution. The Morrison still itself was the obvious answer. The brothers checked it every few days during winter, maintaining equipment, making sure copper hadn't been stolen, preparing for spring production. They went together, usually mid-morning, spent an hour or 2 working, then returned home. The still was located in a hollow 2 miles from the compound, accessible by a rough trail that wound through dense laurel. It was isolated, no witnesses, and the brothers would be focused on work, not on watching for threats. Curtis scouted the still site on January 15th, approaching from a ridgeline that overlooked the hollow. He spent 3 hours watching, noting how the brothers moved, where they positioned themselves, how alert they were. They were careful but not paranoid, checking the perimeter when they arrived, but quickly settling into routine once they felt secure. The still was in a small clearing surrounded by rhododendron and laurel, so thick you couldn't see into the clearing until you were right on top of it. Perfect for concealment, terrible for security. That night, the 4 Hensley brothers met at Virgil's house and planned the final elimination. They would position themselves around the clearing, create a crossfire that would give the Morrisons no chance to escape or fight back. They would use rifles, make it quick, then stage the scene to look like a revenue raid gone wrong. Federal agents were known to shoot first and ask questions later when they encountered stills, and the Morrisons would be carrying weapons, which would make the story plausible. 3 at once is different from 1 at a time, Tom said. 3 gets investigated harder. We need to be sure this can't be traced back. It won't be, Virgil said. We do it right, make it look like feds, nobody will question it. The family will be too scared to push investigation because investigation means exposing their entire operation. February 1st, 1938, a Wednesday morning when temperatures were in the low 30s and fog lay thick in the hollows. The Hensley brothers positioned themselves around the Morrison still site at dawn before the Morrison brothers arrived. Virgil took the north side, Raymond the south, Curtis and Tom the east and west. They wore gloves, carried rifles they'd bought used and untraceable years earlier, waited in cold silence for 3 hours until they heard voices approaching through the laurel. Darren, Mitchell, and Kyle Morrison entered the clearing at 9:30, carrying tools and supplies, talking about spring production plans. They checked the perimeter quickly, saw nothing, began working on the still. For 15 minutes, everything was normal. Then Virgil gave the signal, a mockingbird call, 3 short bursts. 4 rifles fired simultaneously. The sound was enormous, echoing through the hollow. Darren Morrison went down first, hit center mass, dead before he hit the ground. Mitchell turned, tried to run, was shot twice in the back by Raymond. Kyle dropped flat, pulled a pistol, was shot in the head by Curtis before he could return fire. Total elapsed time, 11 seconds. 3 men dead in a clearing 2 miles from help, with no witnesses and no one coming to investigate the gunshots, because gunshots in the mountains were common. The Hensley brothers waited 5 minutes, making sure no one else was nearby, then moved into the clearing. They checked the bodies, confirmed all 3 were dead. Then they spent an hour staging the scene, positioning the bodies to suggest they'd been shot while trying to flee or fight back, placing federal badge replicas they'd made from aluminum foil near the clearing's edge to suggest agents had been present, scattering shell casings to create confusion about how many shooters had been involved. By noon, they were gone, following separate routes back to their vehicles, meeting at a predetermined location 10 miles away. They burned the gloves, stored the rifles in locations they'd never revisit, washed at a creek before driving home. By evening, they were back in their own houses, acting normal, waiting for news. The Morrison bodies were found the next morning by Mitchell's girlfriend, who'd gone looking when the brothers didn't return home by dark. Her screaming brought neighbors who called the sheriff, who called the state police, who called the federal ATF, because the scene looked like a botched raid. For 3 days, investigation focused on whether federal agents had shot the Morrison brothers during an attempted arrest. The ATF denied involvement, but their denials were weak because agents did sometimes conduct raids that weren't officially sanctioned, and mistakes happened. Eventually, the investigation stalled. The medical examiner confirmed 3 deaths by gunshot, but couldn't determine who'd fired the shots. The shell casings were too degraded to provide useful information. The badge replicas were dismissed as crude fakes that could have been made by anyone. The working theory became that rivals had killed the Morrisons and staged the scene to look like a federal raid, but without witnesses or physical evidence, no arrests could be made. The Morrison operation was finished. 5 members dead in 11 weeks, no heirs interested in continuing, property sold off within 6 months. The family scattered, some moving to Tennessee, others to South Carolina, none staying in Madison County. Within a year, it was like the Morrisons had never existed, but the Hensley brothers had miscalculated something fundamental. Violence, once unleashed, doesn't stay contained. It spreads, metastasizes, creates its own momentum, because while they'd eliminated the Morrisons, they'd also created fear throughout the bootleg community. And fear creates suspicion, which creates investigation, which creates discovery. Herschel Coleman, the old bootlegger who'd advised the Hensleys to let it cool, wasn't stupid. He'd seen 5 Morrison deaths in 11 weeks, all explained as accidents or rival violence. He knew the Hensleys had been burned. He knew about grudges and mountain justice. He put pieces together and arrived at a conclusion that made him profoundly uneasy. The Hensley brothers had eliminated an entire operation over a burned still. Coleman didn't go to law enforcement because that wasn't how things were done. But he did start talking to people, quietly, carefully, suggesting that maybe the Morrison deaths weren't accidents, that maybe the Hensleys had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that maybe people who were willing to kill 5 men over copper and corn were people everyone should avoid. The whisper campaign spread through February and into March. Buyers became reluctant to deal with the Hensleys. Suppliers quoted higher prices or claimed they were out of stock. Other bootleggers stopped acknowledging the brothers at gas stations or stores. The reputation the Hensleys had spent 43 years building was evaporating, replaced by something darker. The reputation of men who'd murdered their way through a grudge. By mid-March, Virgil understood what was happening. They'd eliminated their enemies but created something worse, a consensus that the Hensleys were dangerous and unstable, that doing business with them meant risking association with killers. The very reputation they'd tried to protect by killing the Morrisons was being destroyed by the suspicion those killings created. On March 18, 1978, Virgil called his brothers together again. They met at the same kitchen table where they'd planned the elimination campaign 4 months earlier. But this time, the conversation was different. "People are talking," Virgil said. "Coleman's been spreading word that we killed the Morrisons. We're getting blackballed." "Can we prove Coleman's lying?" Tom asked. "We can't prove anything without admitting we did it," Curtis said. "And even if we could, the damage is done. People believe it." "So what do we do?" Raymond asked. Virgil was quiet for a long time. He'd spent 4 months believing that violence would restore their reputation, that eliminating the Morrisons would prove the Hensleys couldn't be disrespected without consequence. Instead, he'd proven something else, that the code he'd lived by his entire life, the code that said reputation was everything and had to be defended at any cost, was fundamentally broken, because reputation couldn't be defended through violence. It could only be earned through trust, and trust, once destroyed, couldn't be restored by killing people. "We're done," Virgil said quietly. "The still's gone. The reputation's gone. We killed 5 men and lost everything anyway." "We can rebuild," Tom said. "Start over somewhere else." "And go through this again?" Virgil shook his head. "We're finished. We thought we were protecting something, but all we did was prove we were the kind of men who solve problems by killing people. That's not a reputation worth having." They sat in silence, 4 men who'd spent their entire lives building something they believed had value, only to discover that the foundation was sand, that the code they'd followed, defend your reputation, never accept disrespect, prove you can't be pushed around, had led them to become the thing they feared most, irrelevant. But the story didn't end there, because while the Hensley brothers were finished with violence, violence wasn't finished with them. 1 week after that conversation, on March 24, 1978, Curtis Hensley was found dead in his truck on a dirt road near Shelton Creek. Single gunshot wound to the head, no witnesses, no obvious motive. The sheriff investigated for 2 weeks, found nothing, eventually ruled it an unsolved homicide that would remain open but inactive. What nobody said publicly but everyone understood was that Curtis had been executed by someone who wanted the Hensleys to know that eliminating 5 Morrisons didn't end the debt. That violence creates violence, and debts get paid in blood until no one is left standing. 3 months later, Tom Hensley died in a house fire that investigators determined was arson, but couldn't trace to any specific perpetrator. The fire started at 3 in the morning, spread quickly, trapped Tom in his bedroom before he could escape. By the time volunteer firefighters arrived, the house was fully engulfed. Raymond Hensley moved to Tennessee in September 1978, changed his name, never returned to Madison County. He died in 2003 of a heart attack, never having spoken publicly about what happened during those 4 months in 1977 and 1978. Virgil Hensley stayed. He stayed in the house his grandfather had built, stayed in the mountains that had been home to 5 generations of his family, stayed even as everyone who knew what he'd done avoided him or wished him dead. Sarah stayed with him, though she never asked about the Morrison deaths, and he never told her. They lived quietly, surviving on Social Security and the small garden they kept, speaking to almost no one. In June 1979, 14 months after the Morrison brothers died in that clearing, Virgil was working in his garden when a truck pulled up. 3 men got out, relatives of the Morrisons who'd moved away after the killings, but had been coming back periodically, asking questions, talking to people, piecing together what had happened. They'd finally assembled enough of the story to feel certain, and certainty had brought them to Virgil's property with rifles and 15 months of grief, looking for somewhere to land. Virgil saw them coming, understood immediately what they wanted, and made no move toward the shotgun he kept inside the house. He stood up from the garden, brushed dirt from his hands, and waited. Sarah was inside making lunch. He hoped they'd leave her alone, hoped this would end with him and go no further. But hope, he'd learned, didn't matter much in the mountains. What mattered was debt, and debt always came due. The men walked up to where Virgil stood. The oldest one, Darren Morrison's son James, was 24 years old, with his father's eyes and his father's build. He'd grown up hunting these mountains, grown up knowing that family honor meant more than law, grown up understanding that some debts could only be paid in blood. "You killed them," James said. It wasn't a question. Virgil didn't answer, didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, just stood there with dirt on his hands and the morning sun warm on his shoulders. "All of them," James continued. "My father, my uncles, my cousins, over a still." "Over respect," Virgil said quietly. "Over 43 years of work they burned like it was nothing." "So you made them nothing," James said. "Erased 5 men because your feelings were hurt." Virgil looked at the younger man and saw his own reflection, saw the same certainty he'd felt that December night when he'd decided the Morrisons needed to die. He saw the same belief that violence could restore something valuable, could settle debts and rebalance scales, and he understood finally that he'd created this moment, had created it the second he decided reputation mattered more than life, had created it when he convinced his brothers that erasure was justice instead of murder. "I was wrong," Virgil said. The words felt strange in his mouth, admission coming too late to matter. "Thought I was defending something worth defending. Turns out I was just destroying. And once you start, it doesn't stop." "No," James agreed. "It doesn't." The gunshot was loud in the quiet morning. Sarah heard it from inside the house, came running, found Virgil face down in the garden he'd been tending, blood soaking into the soil his grandfather had worked, his father had worked, that he'd worked for 61 years. The 3 men were already gone, truck disappearing down the mountain road, leaving behind one more body in a county that had seen too many. The sheriff investigated, found witnesses who'd seen the Morrison truck, found people who understood the motive, found evidence that could have led to arrests. But nobody was interested in pursuing justice. The Hensleys had killed 5 Morrisons. The Morrisons had killed 2 Hensleys in return. The debt was closer to settled now, and pursuing it further would just create new debts, new violence, new bodies. So the investigation was closed, ruled unsolved, filed away with all the other mountain violence that law enforcement had learned couldn't be prevented or punished, only endured. Sarah Hensley buried her husband next to his parents in the cemetery on Highway 25, left flowers, and stopped talking to anyone about what had happened. She lived another 19 years, died in 1998, and was buried next to Virgil. Their headstone carries no epitaph, no explanation, just names and dates that tell visitors nothing about the violence those dates encompass. But the story wasn't finished even then, because violence doesn't end with the people who start it. It spreads outward, touching families and communities, creating trauma that echoes through generations. Between Virgil's death in June 1979 and December of that same year, 4 more people died in Madison County in incidents connected to the Hensley-Morrison feud. A Morrison cousin was killed in a bar fight with a man whose uncle had been friends with Curtis Hensley. A Hensley nephew, who'd had nothing to do with the original killings but carried the family name, was beaten badly enough to require hospitalization by men who never identified themselves. 2 bystanders who'd been suppliers to both operations, who'd refused to take sides and tried to stay neutral, were found dead in circumstances that suggested they'd been executed for knowing too much. By early 1980, the total death count had reached 11. 11 people dead over a burned still, over 43 years of accumulated reputation, over an insult that Virgil Hensley had decided couldn't be tolerated. 11 families destroyed, dozens of children who grew up without fathers, wives who became widows, parents who buried sons, Communities that fractured along lines of loyalty and suspicion that would take decades to heal, if they healed at all. The FBI got involved in August 1979, not because anyone requested help, but because the volume of violence had triggered federal attention. They sent 2 agents to Marshall, conducted interviews, reviewed files, tried to reconstruct what had happened. What they found was a community that had stopped talking to outsiders, that had learned the hard way that cooperation with law enforcement just created new targets. The agents compiled a report that documented 11 deaths connected to bootleg operations, identified the Hensley brothers as probable perpetrators of 5 murders, identified Morrison relatives as probable perpetrators of 3 revenge killings, and concluded that the remaining 3 deaths were collateral damage from a feud that had consumed 2 families and traumatized an entire county. The report was filed, the investigation was closed, and the FBI left Madison County to deal with its own violence. Federal resources were limited, and there were more pressing matters than mountain feuds that had already burned themselves out. The official conclusion was that the Hensley-Morrison killings represented the death throes of the old bootleg economy, a final spasm of violence from men who couldn't adapt to changing times and chose destruction over obsolescence. But that analysis missed something fundamental. The violence wasn't about economics or territory or even moonshine. It was about the collision between 2 different understandings of what reputation meant. For Virgil Hensley and his generation, reputation was something built slowly through consistent action, something that had value because it represented accumulated trust. When that reputation was attacked, defending it wasn't optional, it was survival, because without reputation they had nothing. For the Morrisons and their generation, reputation was different. It was something you took, something you established through dominance and fear, something that had value precisely because it could be taken from others. Burning the Hensleys still wasn't personal to them. It was strategic, a demonstration that the old ways were finished and new powers were rising. They hadn't anticipated that the old ways still had teeth, that men who'd spent 43 years building something were willing to kill to protect it. The collision between those 2 understandings created the violence, not because either side was evil or crazy, but because they were operating from incompatible codes that both insisted reputation was worth defending and neither provided a mechanism for de-escalation. Once the still burned, once the first Morrison died, the logic of reputation demanded escalation. And escalation, in the absence of any authority both sides recognized, led inevitably to elimination. The larger community watched it happen and learned a lesson that had nothing to do with moonshine. They learned that reputation, the thing mountain culture had always insisted was more important than money or property or even life, was also the thing that could destroy you. That the code demanding you defend your reputation was the same code that led to children growing up without fathers and wives, becoming widows, and communities fracturing into permanent hostility. In the years after the Hensley-Morrison killings, something shifted in Madison County. The bootleg economy continued. It had survived too much to be eliminated by one feud. But the culture around it changed. Disputes that would have led to violence in earlier generations were settled through negotiation or avoided entirely. Burns and thefts that would have demanded retaliation were absorbed as costs of doing business. The old code that insisted certain insults couldn't be tolerated was quietly abandoned, replaced by a more pragmatic understanding that survival mattered more than reputation. Herschel Coleman, who'd advised Virgil to let it cool and rebuild, lived until 1989. In his last years, he talked occasionally about the Hensley-Morrison feud, usually to younger bootleggers who wondered why the old-timers were so cautious, so reluctant to stand up for themselves when competitors undercut prices or stole equipment. The Hensleys thought they were defending something important, Coleman would say, thought reputation was worth killing for, and maybe in the old days it was. But what they proved was that killing for reputation just destroys the reputation. Virgil Hensley spent 43 years building trust and 4 months proving he couldn't be trusted. Killed 5 men and lost everything anyway. That's the lesson. Reputation isn't about what you're willing to destroy. It's about what you're willing to build. And you can't build nothing once you start killing. The younger generation listened but didn't always understand. They'd grown up in a different time, when moonshine was becoming nostalgic rather than essential, when the mountain economy was transitioning away from bootleg operations toward tourism and second homes and retirement communities. For them, the Hensley-Morrison feud was history, a story from a world that no longer existed, as remote as the Civil War or Prohibition. But for the families who'd lived through it, the feud was permanent scar tissue. The Morrison name disappeared from Madison County entirely. Every family member moved away, changed names, or stopped acknowledging the connection. The Hensley name remained, but carried weight it hadn't carried before. People who met Raymond Hensley's children or grandchildren would ask carefully if they were related to Virgil, and the answer determined whether the conversation continued or ended. The families who'd been suppliers or buyers during the feud found themselves permanently associated with the violence, even though most had been trying to stay neutral and survive. The site where Darren Mitchell and Kyle Morrison died in that clearing 2 miles up Spring Creek became local legend. Kids would hike up there on dares trying to find the exact spot, looking for shell casings or evidence that wasn't there because the Hensleys had been careful and time had erased what they'd left behind. The hollow acquired a reputation for being haunted, though what haunted it wasn't ghosts, but memory. The understanding that in this specific place, 3 men had died over an insult to reputation that nobody could even quite articulate anymore. The Hensley Still site on Shelton Creek was never rebuilt. After Virgil's death, Sarah refused to let anyone touch the location, and after her death, the land was sold to developers who turned it into vacation homes for retirees from Florida. The spring that had provided water for clean liquor for 43 years now feeds decorative ponds and irrigation systems for landscaped lawns. The only people who know what the site used to be are old-timers who remember, and they're dying, taking the memory with them. In 1995, a graduate student from Appalachian State University came to Madison County researching the social history of bootlegging. She interviewed dozens of people, compiled oral histories, tried to understand how the underground economy had functioned. Eventually, she heard about the Hensley-Morrison feud, but when she tried to research it, she found that records were sparse and witnesses were reluctant to talk. The few people who would discuss it gave contradictory accounts. Some insisted the Morrisons had deserved what happened. Others claimed the Hensleys were murderers who'd destroyed 2 families over hurt feelings. Still others suggested the whole thing had been exaggerated and most of the deaths were unrelated coincidences. The graduate student tried to reconcile the conflicting narratives and eventually gave up. Her dissertation included 2 paragraphs about alleged violence between competing bootleg operations in the late 1970s, but didn't name the families involved and concluded that the truth was impossible to determine because mountain communities protected their own history, even when that history was violent. She was right, but what she didn't understand was that the protection wasn't about loyalty or secrecy. It was about shame. The people who'd lived through the feud were ashamed of what had happened, ashamed that their community had produced that level of violence, ashamed that the code they'd been raised to respect had led to 11 deaths and nothing gained. By the time the 20th century ended, the Hensley-Morrison feud had faded into the kind of story that gets told in bars late at night, when the drinking has gone on long enough that truth and legend blend together. The details changed with each telling, Sometimes the Hensleys killed 6 Morrisons, sometimes 8. Sometimes the retaliation involved a shootout that lasted hours. Sometimes Virgil Hensley killed himself rather than being murdered. The core remained constant. Families who destroyed each other over moonshine and reputation, violence that spread until no one remembered exactly why it had started. A cautionary tale about the cost of defending honor in a world that had stopped valuing honor the way it once had. But facts remain, even when stories distort them. 11 people died in Madison County, North Carolina, between November 1977 and December 1979, in violence connected to bootleg operations and family feuds. The deaths were Billy Morrison, December 1977, truck accident that wasn't an accident. Roger Morrison, January 1978, hunting accident that wasn't an accident. Darren Morrison, February 1978, shot in still sight elimination. Mitchell Morrison, February 1978, shot in still sight elimination. Kyle Morrison, February 1978, shot in still sight elimination. Curtis Hensley, March 1978, executed in revenge killing. Tom Hensley, June 1978, killed in arson fire. Virgil Hensley, June 1979, shot by Morrison relatives. James Caldwell, August 1979, Morrison cousin killed in bar fight connected to feud. Robert Hensley, October 1979, nephew beaten to death for family association. 2 additional deaths in late 1979, suppliers who knew too much and were eliminated by unknown parties to prevent testimony. 11 lives, 11 funerals, dozens of children who grew up asking why their fathers were dead and receiving answers that satisfied no one. Communities that fractured along lines of loyalty and suspicion. An economy that was already dying, further damaged by violence that made everyone more vulnerable to law enforcement attention. And at the center of it all, one burned still. 43 years of accumulated craft and reputation reduced to charred copper and twisted metal by men who thought they were sending a message about power. The FBI report on the Blue Ridge Reckoning, filed in December 1979 and declassified in 2004, runs to 73 pages. Most of it is documentation of interviews that went nowhere and evidence that proved nothing. But the final paragraph, written by the lead investigator, captures something essential about what happened. The subjects in this case were not criminal enterprises in the modern sense. They were family operations that had existed for generations, following codes of behavior that predated federal law and sometimes contradicted it. The violence that destroyed the Hensley and Morrison families was not the product of criminal ambition, but of cultural values that could not adapt to changing circumstances. When reputation ceased to have economic value, but men continued to act as if it did, the result was conflict that could only be resolved through elimination. The tragedy is that all parties understood they were destroying themselves, even as they continued the violence, but the code they followed provided no mechanism for stopping short of total destruction. This case represents the end of a particular kind of American subculture, one that valued honor over survival and could not exist once that priority became unsustainable. The investigator was correct, but incomplete. What ended in Madison County in those years wasn't just a subculture, it was an entire understanding of how reputation functioned in communities where formal law was absent or untrustworthy. For generations, mountain people had survived by building reputations that substituted for legal contracts and law enforcement. Your word was your bond because your reputation guaranteed it, and reputation had to be defended because without it, you couldn't function economically or socially. That system had worked for 200 years, surviving wars and depressions and federal crackdowns because everyone who participated understood the rules and the consequences. What Virgil Hensley couldn't accept was that the system had stopped working, that the younger generation represented by the Morrisons didn't value reputation the way his generation did. saw it as weakness rather than strength, something to be exploited rather than respected. When the Morrisons burned the Hensley still, they were declaring that the old rules were finished. When Virgil responded with violence, he was trying to enforce rules that no longer had power, and when both sides committed to elimination, they were proving that the system couldn't function anymore, that reputation couldn't be defended through violence without destroying the reputation in the process. The families who remained in Madison County after the feud understood this in ways they couldn't quite articulate. They stopped emphasizing reputation as the foundation of their business dealings. They started using written contracts even in the bootleg economy, started involving lawyers and mediators when disputes arose, started accepting losses that earlier generations would have felt compelled to avenge. The code changed because the Hensley-Morrison feud had proven the old code led to extinction. By 2010, Madison County had transformed entirely. The bootleg economy that had sustained families for generations was essentially extinct, replaced by legal distilleries producing craft moonshine for tourists and collectors. The mountain communities that had been isolated were connected by improved roads and internet access. Young people left for college and career opportunities, returning only for holidays or not at all. The values that had made reputation worth killing for, isolation, oral culture, distrust of formal institutions, family honor, were fading, replaced by values more compatible with modern economic participation. The Hensley-Morrison feud became an artifact, a story from a vanished world. The physical locations where the violence occurred were transformed or forgotten. The families who'd participated were scattered or silent. The code that had created the violence was abandoned, and the only memorial to 11 dead was oral history growing more distorted with each passing year, becoming legend instead of fact, losing specificity until all that remained was the ghost of a story about men who killed each other over something they called honor. But late at night in certain bars in Marshall and Hot Springs, if you're local and trusted and the drinking has gone on long enough that truth becomes possible, old men will still tell you about the Hensley brothers and what they did. They'll tell you about copper stills and burned reputations and violence that spread like wildfire through communities that had no mechanism for stopping it. They'll tell you it was about moonshine, but then they'll get quiet and admit it was about something deeper, about pride, about refusing to accept disrespect, about men who'd rather destroy everything than admit the world had changed in ways they couldn't control. And if you ask them whether the Hensleys were right or wrong, whether defending their reputation was justified or insane, they'll look at you with expressions that carry the weight of everything those years cost their community. And they'll say what Herschel Coleman said before he died, that reputation isn't about what you're willing to destroy, it's about what you're willing to build. And once you start destroying, there's nothing left to build with. The Hensleys learned that. The Morrisons learned that. Madison County learned that. 11 people died teaching a lesson nobody wanted to learn, but everyone had to understand. That some codes, no matter how long they've existed or how deeply they're believed, stop working. And when they stop working but men keep following them anyway, the result isn't honor, it's just bodies. The last Hensley brother, Raymond, who'd fled to Tennessee in 1978, died in 2003 at the age of 66. His obituary mentioned his military service, his work in construction, his wife and children and grandchildren. It made no reference to Madison County, to bootlegging, to the 4 months in which he and his brothers had eliminated 5 men over a burned still. His family either didn't know or had decided the truth was better left buried with the bodies. At his funeral, only 3 people attended who'd known him during those years. They didn't speak to each other, didn't acknowledge the shared history, didn't mention what Raymond had done or what had been done to his family. They came, paid respects, and left, carrying memories they'd never share because the memories were too heavy, too complicated, too stained with blood that had soaked into mountain soil and never washed away. One of those three was a woman named Margaret Preston, who'd been Curtis Hensley's girlfriend in 1977. She was 71 years old at Raymond's funeral, living in Florida, hadn't been back to North Carolina in 20 years. But when she heard Raymond had died, she'd felt compelled to attend, to bear witness to the end of something she'd watched destroy the man she'd loved. After the funeral, she drove to Madison County, to the places where the violence had occurred. The Hensley property was now a subdivision, the family home demolished and replaced by cookie-cutter houses that looked nothing like the mountains around them. The Morrison compound up Spring Creek was a church camp, cheerful buildings and playgrounds occupying land where men had planned murders and mourned their dead. The clearing where 3 Morrison brothers had been shot was part of the Pisgah National Forest now, accessible by a hiking trail that carried no historical markers or explanation of what had happened there. Margaret stood in that clearing for an hour, trying to reconcile the peaceful forest around her with the violence she knew had occurred in this exact spot. She was old enough to remember when the mountains had been different, when isolation and poverty and federal indifference had created communities that lived by their own rules and defended those rules with violence when necessary. She was old enough to remember when men like Virgil Hensley were respected instead of feared, when reputation meant something concrete instead of being an abstract concept for social media profiles. But she was also old enough to understand that the world that had produced the Hensley-Morrison feud was better off dead, that the code those men had followed, the code that said certain insults demanded violence and reputation, was worth more than life, was a code that had never worked as well as people pretended. It had always produced violence, had always created widows and orphans, had always burned through families and communities, leaving trauma in its wake. The Hensley-Morrison feud wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a code that had been destructive from the beginning but had been sustained because people believed they had no alternative. Modern life provided alternatives, boring alternatives, frustrating alternatives, alternatives that often felt like surrendering to forces beyond your control, but alternatives that let people resolve disputes without killing each other, that let families survive past one generation, that let communities function without constant fear that violence could erupt over perceived disrespect. Margaret left the clearing as the sun was setting, drove back down the mountain to Highway 25, and continued south toward Florida. She never returned to Madison County. She died in 2015, carrying memories of Curtis Hensley that she never shared with her children or grandchildren, carrying the knowledge of what men in her community had done and what it had cost, carrying shame that was hers simply by proximity to the violence. There are no monuments to the 11 people who died in the Blue Ridge Reckoning, no historical markers, no museum exhibits, no official acknowledgement that it happened. Madison County moved on, buried its dead, and tried to forget. The forgetting was mostly successful. Most people who live there now don't know the story. The names Hensley and Morrison carry no particular weight, trigger no memories, connect to no history. But in the county courthouse in Marshall, if you know where to look, you can find records. Death certificates for 11 people who died between November 1977 and December 1979. Incident reports filed by the Sheriff's Department. Federal investigation files that are now declassified. Medical examiner reports describing gunshot wounds and blunt force trauma and bodies burned beyond easy recognition. The documentary evidence exists, proving the story is real, even as the story fades from memory. And if you follow the paper trail far enough, if you compile all the evidence and timeline all the deaths, and map all the connections, What emerges is a portrait of how violence functions in isolated communities. Not random violence, not senseless violence, but violence that follows its own logic, that makes sense to the people committing it even as it destroys them. The Hensley brothers didn't kill because they enjoyed killing. They killed because their entire understanding of how the world worked said that allowing the still burn to go unanswered would prove they were weak, would destroy their ability to function economically, would erase everything they'd built. And once they started killing, the logic of violence demanded they continue until the threat was eliminated completely. The Morrison relatives who killed Curtis, Tom, and Virgil Hensley weren't acting from cruelty. They were following the same logic, that family honor demanded retaliation, that allowing murders to go unanswered would prove weakness, that the only way to stop the violence was to match it. Neither side wanted the escalation, but neither side could see a way to stop without surrendering the values that defined who they were. And that's the real lesson of the Blue Ridge Reckoning. Not that mountain people are violent, or that bootleggers are criminals, or that poverty creates crime. The lesson is that codes of honor, when rigidly applied in contexts where formal institutions are weak or absent, lead inevitably to violence, because honor demands response to insult, and response creates counter-response, and the only way to stop the cycle is through elimination or surrender. And surrender to men raised to value honor above survival isn't an option. So elimination becomes the only outcome, and families destroy each other, proving points that nobody remembers once the bodies are buried. The world that produced the Hensley-Morrison feud is gone now, destroyed not by the violence itself, but by economic and social changes that made the old codes unsustainable. Modern communities can't function on reputation alone. They need formal institutions, written contracts, legal recourse, mechanisms for dispute resolution that don't involve killing. Mountain communities resisted those institutions for generations, seeing them as threats to autonomy and cultural identity. But the resistance cost more than it preserved, and eventually even the most isolated hollows had to accept that the old ways were finished. What remains is memory, growing fainter with each passing year, memory of men who killed and died over a burned still, over 43 years of reputation reduced to ash, over an insult that demanded response because the code they'd been raised under insisted certain things couldn't be tolerated. Memory of 11 lives ended and dozens more destroyed by the ripple effects of violence that no one could stop once it started. Memory of a culture that valued honor so highly it couldn't survive contact with a world that valued survival more. And in the end, that's all the Hensley brothers and the Morrison family and the 11 dead have left. Memory preserved in courthouse records and oral histories and stories told in bars when the drinking has gone on long enough. Memory that serves as warning to generations that never knew the code those men followed. Memory that explains why certain old-timers get quiet when you mention reputation or honor or defending what's yours. Memory of violence that solved nothing, proved nothing, and destroyed everything it touched. 11 people dead, 11 families broken, 1 county traumatized, all because 4 brothers decided reputation was worth killing for. And once they made that decision, the logic of violence carried them to its inevitable conclusion. The Blue Ridge Reckoning stands as testament to the cost of honor when honor refuses to adapt to reality, when reputation becomes more important than life, when code matters more than consequences. The mountains where it happened are still there, as beautiful and indifferent as they've always been. The hollows where stills once ran are silent now except for wind and water, and tourists hiking trails that lead through history they don't recognize. The ridges that witnessed generations of bootlegging and violence and survival bear no scars, show no evidence of what was built and destroyed there, Nature has reclaimed what was always hers, erased human drama with the patience of geology and ecology that operate on time scales where human violence is momentary static. But the story remains, preserved in documents and memory, and the occasional retelling by people old enough to remember when reputation meant something concrete and dangerous. The story of the Hensley brothers who burned down their world trying to protect it, who killed 11 people and lost everything anyway, who proved that some codes, no matter how deeply believed or long practiced, lead only to destruction. The story of men who confused honor with pride, reputation with dominance, justice with revenge, and paid for that confusion with their lives and the lives of everyone they touched. That's the Blue Ridge Reckoning, not a victory, not a tragedy in the classical sense, but a collapse. The disintegration of a system that had sustained mountain communities for generations but couldn't adapt when the world changed. 11 people died, marking that collapse, their deaths serving as punctuation to a sentence 2 centuries in the writing, that honor cultures, however noble in theory, become death cults when they refuse to evolve. And now, 45 years after the first Morrison cousin died on that icy road, the story is all that's left. The people are dead or scattered. The families are destroyed or hiding. The locations are transformed. The culture that created the violence is extinct. Only the story remains, growing more distant and less immediate with each year, fading toward the status of legend, becoming the kind of tale people tell to explain why things are the way they are now, why the old ways ended, why no one talks about reputation the way their grandparents did. This is that story, told while the last witnesses still live, preserved before memory completes its transformation into myth. 11 people died in the mountains of North Carolina over a burned still and the reputation it destroyed. They died believing violence was the answer to questions about honor and respect, and how men should respond to insults, in communities where law was absent or untrustworthy. They were wrong, but they couldn't see that until after the bodies had fallen and the damage was permanent. And that wrongness, that inability to see beyond the code they'd been raised to follow, that faith in violence as the solution to problems violence had created, that's what killed them. Not bullets or fire or blunt force trauma, though those were the mechanisms. What killed them was belief in a code that had stopped working but still demanded adherence. A code that promised honor but delivered only death. A code that said reputation was everything, even as it destroyed everything reputation was supposed to protect. The Blue Ridge Reckoning is finished now, its violence expended, its participants dead or silent, its lesson learned at terrible cost. The mountains remember nothing. The communities have moved on. The only witness that remains is time, which preserves everything and judges nothing, which records violence and peace with equal indifference, which carries the story forward until the last person who remembers is gone, and the story becomes history, becomes legend, becomes one more tale about men who died over something that seemed important once, but makes no sense to anyone anymore. That's how it ends. Not with resolution or justice or meaning, but with silence and forgetting and the slow erosion of memory until all that remains is a number, 11, and a place. Madison County, North Carolina, and a time frame, 1977 to 1979, and the knowledge that something violent happened there, involving moonshine and reputation and men who wouldn't compromise. And maybe that's appropriate, maybe the only fitting memorial to violence that served no purpose and solved nothing is silence. Maybe the best honor we can give to people who died for honor is to forget them, to let their story fade, to refuse to perpetuate the code that killed them by pretending it was noble or justified or anything other than destructive. Or maybe we tell the story one more time, preserve it before it's too late, so future generations can see clearly what honor culture costs when it refuses to die gracefully, so they can understand that reputation, however valuable, is never worth more than life. So they can learn from 11 deaths that defending pride with violence doesn't preserve anything. It only destroys. The Hensley brothers learned that lesson, but only after it was too late to matter. The Morrisons learned it too. Madison County learned it, and now if you've stayed with this story to its end, you've learned it as well. That honor is worth having but not worth killing for. That reputation built through violence is reputation destroyed. That codes of behavior, however old or deeply believed, become death sentences when they stop aligning with reality. 11 people died proving that truth. Their deaths bought no justice, restored no honor, protected no reputation. They died for nothing because everything they believed was worth dying for was destroyed by their deaths. That's the Blue Ridge reckoning. That's the price of honor when honor refuses to compromise. That's what happens when reputation matters more than life. Remember it, learn from it, and then, perhaps, let it rest.